After 8 years of marriage, my husband's ex posted a picture of a property deed on her social media. Her caption, "Choosing a man is choosing your future." At first, I was stunned. Then, out of sheer instinct, I left a comment, "It's always better to rely on yourself." But she deleted it before I had a chance to retrieve it. Not 5 minutes later, my husband, James, called. I thought he'd ask about what happened. Instead, he dove straight into yelling. "Lindsay's struggling to pay off her mortgage. It's tough for a woman on her own. What's wrong with me helping her with a loan payment? Don't I have the right to spend my own money? Stop causing trouble for her." In the background, I could hear Lindsay sobbing, with people around her murmuring in sympathy. I was stunned, frozen for a second, and James had already hung up and blocked me by the time I snapped out of it. An hour later, Lindsay posted again. This time, a transfer agreement showed that she now owned 50% of the company's shares. This was James's way of compensating her. To me, it felt like a deliberate challenge. But this time, I didn't care. When James finally came home that night, I had just thrown away the empty syringe from my pregnancy-preserving shot. It was our second pregnancy, and at only 2 months in, I was already displaying symptoms that indicated a potential miscarriage. That morning, I noticed some bleeding and rushed to the hospital. The doctor said if I wanted to keep the baby, I needed to take daily shots right on time. POS 12 o'clock to 6, but I hadn't planned on telling James about the pregnancy. I had planned a nice dinner to celebrate his birthday one last time. He promised he'd come home, but as day turned to night, all I saw was Lindsay's gloating post. After that call, during which he accused me of causing trouble, I numbly got up and threw away the meal I had spent hours preparing. When James walked in and noticed the empty dining table, he frowned, clearly irritated. "Did you forget what day it is?" Of course, I remembered. It was James' birthday. No matter how busy I was every year, I'd take the day off, make his favorite dishes, and bake a cake from scratch. I never missed it, from my days as a junior employee to now as a senior manager. But this year was different. This year was the last, and James hadn't even bothered to come home on time. Without looking at him, I scrolled through Lindsay's old posts. It hit me then that since she started working as James's secretary, she had been flaunting gifts from him. In just a year, she had received more than I had in 8 years of marriage. A sarcastic smile crept across my face. "Spent nearly $1 million on her, and she still couldn't treat you to dinner." James didn't see that coming, and his impatience flared. "What's wrong with you? Those were year-end bonuses. Secretaries work hard, so I gave her more. What's the big deal? Don't you understand management? Isn't that part of your job? Oh, and do you also give your regular employees shares in Riverview mansions? You're a pretty generous boss. Maybe I should quit my job and come work for you." His face darkened just as his phone chimed with a new message. Glancing at the screen, his expression softened, and a smile tugged at his lips. I didn't need to ask. It was Lindsay. When he looked back at me, the anger was gone. "I've explained everything, and I didn't even get upset about your comment on her post. If I had something going on with her, do you think I'd be here tonight? What am I, a masochist who enjoys your cold stares?" I ignored him and walked to the kitchen. Of course, he thought I felt guilty and was about to make dinner to smooth things over. "Forget it," he sighed. "Don't bother cooking this late. I'll grab something from the cake shop. Can you imagine celebrating my birthday like this, dealing with your moods? What did I do to deserve this?" As James spoke, I exited the kitchen, holding a trash bag. When he saw me heading for the door, he froze. Turning to me with a wary look, he snapped, "I'm just going to buy a cake. Why are you following me? What do you think I'm going to do in an hour? You're losing it. Why don't you just put a surveillance camera on me while you're at it?" I understood why James was angry. In the past, whenever he came home late from work or some social event, I'd ask him to share his location so I wouldn't worry. I decided to give James a ride if he drank too much, but he took it the wrong way every time, accusing me of being controlling. This time, though, I didn't bother calling him out on his lie about the cake. I knew he didn't even like sweets. Instead, I just lifted the trash bag in my hand and gave it a little shake. "Don't overthink it. I'm just taking out the trash." Maybe it was the string of misunderstandings finally catching up with him, but his tone softened as if offering a truce. "After you throw the garbage, let's grab something to eat. That barbecue spot is pretty good." Thinking this might be our last dinner together, I nodded. 20 minutes later, James dropped me off on the side of the road in front of a rundown barbecue stall. Before I could even look around, he floored it, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The dirt splashed right onto my face. I quickly covered my eyes and turned away, realizing the stall wasn't open tonight. Nearby, 2 other food stands cluttered with greasy tables caught my eye. Shirtless, middle-aged men with bloated bellies sat around, casting lecherous glances my way. I hadn't realized how quickly I'd rushed out. I was still in my nightgown. Then, I found myself huddled on the steps by the road, feeling vulnerable and alone. It was nearly midnight. This deserted alley wasn't exactly buzzing with available taxis. I felt a cold sweat starting to form. Just as I was about to reach for my phone to call the police, a drunk man staggered toward me, swaying with a beer bottle in hand. I noticed a wedding ring on his finger as he slurred, "Hey girl, how about a drink? Out here alone this late? $200, come with me." My face went cold as I stepped back. "Get lost. Stay the hell away from me." Fueled by the alcohol, he got angry, lunging at me and smashing the beer bottle on the ground. Luckily, the noise caught the attention of a passing car. The driver stopped and offered to take me home. I couldn't stop shaking from fear the whole ride back. As soon as I got home, a sharp pain shot through my abdomen. I downed a glass of hot water, trying to calm myself, just as James stormed in, slamming the door. "How could you come back without telling me?" I circled that alley a dozen times, scared out of my mind that something had happened to you. I almost called the cops. "Do you think this is some kind of game?" I froze, gripping the glass tightly, my 000% 12:37 expression going cold. If James had been looking for me, he would have seen that the barbecue stall was closed. Clutching my stomach, I shot back with a mocking smile. "Worried about me? You left me in a place like that. Were you scared something might happen to me, or scared nothing would? And you expect me to tell you?" I tried, but I guess I'm still blocked, so that was impossible, wasn't it? God knew how often I'd tried calling him while stranded, rehearsing my last words in case something went wrong. His lips pressed into a thin line, realizing his mistake. Frustrated, he threw the cake he had brought down on the table. Kindness. Wasted. James stormed off to the bathroom, and I could faintly hear him laughing, as if he were finding the whole situation ridiculous. The pain in my abdomen became unbearable, and I collapsed onto the sofa, my face turning pale. I glanced over at the cake he'd thrown. A piece was already missing. With shaking hands, I opened Lindsay's latest post on social media. In the picture, two shadows were reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows of a Riverview mansion. A strawberry cake with a single candle sat in the corner. Her caption read, "For every birthday from now on, we'll be by each other's side. The ultimate expression of love is in the ritual." I fought back tears, trying to stay calm for the sake of pregnancy. I couldn't cry, not now. Gripping the sofa for support, I threw the cake into the trash. James came out of the bathroom just in time to see what I had done, his face darkening with anger. "What's your problem now? You're the one always going on about rituals. I drove across half the city to get you that cake, and you just toss it away. I've explained this 100 times, and you're still not satisfied. All I did was give an employee a house as a reward. Are you ever going to let this go? Have I ever brought up how you insulted her? Since I got home, you've treated me like crap. First you ditched dinner, and now the cake. What do you think I am? Made of patience?" I closed my eyes, too frustrated to even look at him anymore. "I'm not throwing a tantrum. You're right, it's your money, and you can spend it however you want. I'm not as free as Lindsay is. I've got my work." Before I could finish, he cut me off, shouting, "Enough. You say this every time. Ever since Lindsay joined the company, you've been acting crazy every day. No wonder the baby didn't make it. With a mother and a family like this, it's a blessing he wasn't born." Before I could register his words, my hand flew up and slapped him across the face. I screamed at my husband, "Don't you dare talk to me about the child. Having a father like you would be his misfortune." Without waiting for a response, I spun around and ran into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. A second later, I heard James outside, yelling in frustration. Eventually, the shouting faded and tears streamed uncontrollably down my face. When Lindsay joined the company, things had changed between us. My sense of security vanished, replaced by suspicion and anxiety. I found myself constantly wondering if he still loved me. At one point, I even considered having a child just to keep him tied to me. But when I first showed him the positive pregnancy test, I'll never forget the furious, twisted look on his face. He had been texting Lindsay then, and in a split second, he smashed his phone against the table, shattering the screen. "The company's expanding, and money is tight. I can't afford a kid right now. Just get rid of it." I was shocked, angry, and heartbroken, but I stood my ground and refused. Not long after, James invited me to a business event. We hadn't gone anywhere together in 2 years, so I assumed it was work-related and agreed with little thought. But when I found myself surrounded by a group of greasy, middle-aged men raising their glasses toward me, I realized what was happening. I glanced at him, hoping for help, but he was too busy bragging about how much I could drink. Forced to down glass after glass, my tears mixed with the liquor. An hour later, I collapsed to the ground, my skirt soaked in blood. Only then did James finally take me to the hospital, but it was too late. The baby was gone. That's why I hadn't told him about this pregnancy. If he hadn't used the excuse of being too broke to raise a child back then, maybe I wouldn't have been so triggered by his actions of giving away houses and company shares like they were nothing. Looking back, he probably had plans for that money all along. Our child's existence disrupted his pursuit of his true love, and that's why he was so angry. Seeing Lindsay's latest post on social media confirmed what I already knew. This marriage was over. When I woke up the following day, James was already gone. I called a lawyer and had divorce papers drawn up. While preparing to send them to his office, I saw a celebratory video on their corporate account. Lindsay was promoted to company shareholder, holding the same title as James. She was no longer just a secretary. She now held an executive position. In the video, they hold champagne glasses, toasting each other as employees cheer them on. James's wedding ring was replaced by a more delicate one that matches Lindsay's, a new model from this year's collection. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. I remember when we got married, his company was just starting out. I only asked for the cheapest ring at the store to ease his financial burden. He was moved to tears and promised to buy me the most expensive ring when he made more money. 8 years later, the ring he promised me ended on another woman's finger. Just as I finished sending the divorce papers, James called. "I'll pick you up tonight. The company is having a team building event. Lindsay said she wants to clear up any misunderstandings between you two." 64-8 before I could respond, he hung up. I didn't expect him to unblock me right before the divorce, and I wasn't sure whether to feel amused or heartbroken. A mocking smile crept onto my lips. A misunderstanding? Is she here to explain or to show off? I thought. But at that point, I didn't care anymore. After finalizing the divorce agreement, I went to the hospital for a checkup. The doctor prescribed more medication and warned me that my condition was worse than before. He stressed that I needed to keep my emotions in check, as any stress could affect the baby. Taking his advice seriously, I picked up my medication and went home. I started looking for a new place to live, knowing I couldn't stay in this toxic environment. It wasn't safe for me or for the baby. After searching all day, I found a place and paid the deposit. I gave myself the prescribed injection, and just as I started packing, I got a notification that James's car had pulled up downstairs. I went down in my pajamas, thinking we could talk seriously. But the moment he saw me, his face twisted in disgust. "You're going out like that? Can you stop embarrassing me? People will think I can't even afford to buy you makeup." Sitting in the passenger seat, with her perfect makeup, Lindsay giggled and opened the door. Standing next to her, I felt even more worn out and drained. Before I could respond, she smiled brightly and nudged me into the back seat. "Oh, Shannon, no need to get all dressed up. You're already beautiful enough. Besides, do you think James would even let you leave the house if you got all dolled up?" The door shut behind me, and she casually slid back into the front seat. They chatted non-stop during the drive, while I sat in the 412 o'clock 68914 back, feeling like a complete outsider. In our 8 years of marriage, I had never seen James this eager to share anything with me. At that moment, I clearly felt the difference between being loved and not being loved. When the car finally stopped, I was shocked to see that the team building event was being held at the same barbecue stall where I had almost been assaulted the other night. The owner was open for business this time, and the tables outside were packed with company employees. When they saw James step out with Lindsay, they rushed to greet the two, calling them Mr. Carter and Miss Thompson, while the employees ushered them to the center of attention. I scanned the area and noticed only one seat left in the corner. At that moment, Lindsay playfully smacked her forehead and stuck out her tongue, as if she had just remembered something. "Oh, show percent 12 o'clock 718 no. I totally forgot about Shannon's seat. Can someone make some room?" Before I could say a word, James had already spoken for me, turning down her offer. "There's no need. I'll just sit here. It's just dinner." I didn't argue. I walked straight to the corner seat. The table was full of new hires, none of whom knew who I was. James didn't bother introducing me, so no one tried to talk to me. I was grateful for the quiet. It wasn't until I overheard a conversation that I realized Lindsay had suggested this place. She was reminiscing about how she and James came here often in school. I only took a few bites when a familiar voice sounded in my ear. Well, isn't this the girl who wouldn't take my offer that night? Back again tonight to look for clients. How about $500 bucks this time? Deal?" Goosebumps prickled over my skin as soon as I heard the voice. James glanced my way, his expression darkening, but he didn't budge. It was my male colleagues who stepped in to handle the situation. Meanwhile, James just raised his glass with a cold, condescending smile. "No wonder I couldn't find you that night. Looks like you were busy with your business." I froze in shock, my face flushing with anger and humiliation. I stood abruptly, ready to leave, but Lindsay rushed over, blocking my path. "It's all my fault," she said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I shouldn't have picked this place. I'm so sorry. Tonight was supposed to clear up misunderstandings and now I've made it worse. I'll punish myself. I'll drink." Before I could respond, she grabbed a bottle and downed it. The diamond on her finger caught the light, sharp and blinding. Only then did James finally move. He walked over, his voice laced with irritation. "Lindsay already apologized. What more do you want? Just let it go and stop making a scene." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, so she apologizes and I'm supposed to just forgive her. Is that how it works now?" James's frustration boiled over. His brows furrowed as he snapped back. "She already drank for you and you're still going on about this. Even if you're mad, there's a limit." He shoved a bottle of alcohol into my hand, the message clear. I pressed my lips together, my fury threatening to spill over. But I kept my voice ice cold. "I can't drink. I've got somewhere else to be, so I'm leaving." Before I could walk away, James grabbed me by the neck, his grip tight. "Shannon, 000120124, have I been too nice to you? Lindsay drank an entire bottle for you, and you're just going to walk out." He yanked me hard, slamming me against his chest. He pried the bottle open and forced it toward my mouth. The liquor poured down my chin, soaking my clothes as I choked and coughed, clutching my stomach in pain. He tossed the empty bottle to the ground, still fuming. "Don't be ungrateful." Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the physical strain. His angry, threatening words kept coming. "Apologize to Lindsay or we're getting divorced. I'm done with this." Everyone around us expected me to explode, to lose control. But I didn't. I composed myself, even as my face burned with humiliation. I nodded calmly. "Fine, then. Let's get divorced." I took 2 steps, but Lindsay grabbed my arm, panic creeping into her voice. "Don't be impulsive. Divorce isn't a small thing. You shouldn't do this because of me. Get lost." I yanked my arm free, sending her stumbling backward. James snapped, his fury exploding. He grabbed an empty bottle from the table and hurled it at the back of my head. The next moment, I collapsed. Crimson blood pooled beneath my nightgown, soaking the floor. James froze, terror spreading across his face. It was as if he couldn't understand why, after hitting my head, the blood was coming from my lower body. At that instant, the reality seemed to hit him. He rushed over, lifting me up, shaking me violently. The people around us were frozen in shock, too scared to breathe. All I could hear was James' panicked voice. "Shannon, stop pretending. Are you done yet? Talk to me. Don't think I'll feel sorry just because of this." I was losing too much blood. As James spoke, his voice became less confident, causing my face to visibly pale. Meanwhile, a flicker of triumph passed through Lindsay's eyes, but she quickly realized how serious the situation was. After a long pause, she stepped forward, her voice cautious. "You should take her to the hospital. I think, Shannon, she's miscarried." At the word miscarriage, James froze as if waking up from a nightmare. In a panic, he scooped me into his arms and rushed to the car, completely disoriented. Just as Lindsay tried to climb in, Lames floored it, speeding without her. That final team building event ended in bloodshed. As I lay in the back seat, every bump in the road made the pain worse. My head throbbed and my abdomen felt like it was being ripped apart. I was numb, heartbroken. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw blood soaking into the car seat beneath me. I never thought that after everything, I still couldn't save this child. Maybe fate told me we weren't meant to have a child together. For the first time, James had chosen me over Lindsay. The victory I had been waiting for came at a moment like this. 213 tears slipped from my eyes as everything went dark. When the surgery was over, the nurse wheeled me out of the operating room. James rushed over to the doctor, his voice trembling. "How is she? Is she okay?" The doctor's expression was cold, his tone harsh. "Are you the patient's family? Don't you know she's had a history of violent miscarriages? This pregnancy required extra care. She's been on injections for days with no improvement, and you still let her drink. Are you trying to kill her?" The doctor continued, his voice sharp. "And what about the blunt trauma to her head? If this was caused by someone, you should call the police. This isn't an accident. It's practically an attempted murder." If you'd brought her in any later, I wouldn't have been able to save her. James's face drained of color, guilt etched into every line. When I finally woke up in the hospital room, he was sitting next to the bed, his head buried in his hands. As soon as he heard me stir, he looked up, his voice barely steady. "Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? That was my child, too. If I had known, I wouldn't have." I cut him off before he could finish. "There's nothing left to say. Even if you had known, you wouldn't have let me keep the baby." I took a breath and continued, my voice calm. "Let's get divorced. I've already sent the papers to your company. Just sign them and we'll be done." I continued, "I never cared about the money or the assets. But now, I'm taking back what's mine. What you gave her during our marriage. I'll be suing Lindsay for it. So you should start preparing." James's face twisted in disbelief. I half expected him to argue, to defend Lindsay. But after a long pause, he clenched his jaw and finally spoke. "I can explain everything. That happened before. But why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? It wasn't just your child. It was mine, too." I gave him a bitter smile, not even bothering to look at him. "Tell you. You've been spending all the money meant for raising a child on houses and shares for Lindsay. What would be the point? You'd just think I was using the baby to fight for your assets. And then get berated by you again. Why would I bother?" James froze, the second half of his sentence swallowed back. For a moment, a flicker of struggle crossed his face, as if he were remembering all his past mistakes. Just as he opened his mouth to explain, the door to the hospital room swung open. Lindsay walked gracefully, holding a lunchbox in one hand and a stack of documents under her arm, her face radiating sweetness and concern. "Shannon, are you okay? It's all my fault. I didn't know you were pregnant. I never would have asked you out to eat if I had known. Fuck, I feel terrible for causing another misunderstanding between you and James." Before she could finish, James's expression darkened, and for once, he turned on her. His voice was sharp. "Who told you to come in without knocking? Do you behave like this at home, too? This isn't the company, and it's definitely not your home." Lindsay's smile faltered, her eyes widening in disbelief. She stood there for a moment, stunned by his harsh tone. Then, tears welled in her eyes, and she dropped the lunchbox and papers before running out of the room, visibly shaken. I couldn't help but let out a mocking laugh. "Aren't you going to chase after her? This time, half your company's shares might not be enough to win her back. Maybe you should give her the entire company." James's face flushed with embarrassment. He didn't argue, knowing he was in the wrong. Instead, he bent down to pick up the scattered papers. But when his hand landed on them, he froze. Right on top was the divorce agreement I had sent to his office, and underneath was Lindsay's pregnancy report. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him hastily tear them up and toss the pieces into the trash. A cold smile tugged at my lips. He thought he was clever, thinking he had hidden it from me as if I didn't already know. But his act was laughable. I had been so blinded by love that I had deceived myself too. With those feelings gone, I saw him for what he indeed was. A pitiful clown. I discovered Lindsay's pregnancy before he did, thanks to a sneaky social media post she made, one she had set to be visible only to me. I had blocked her post then, but when I unblocked her, I found the surprise waiting. Even after shredding the papers, James couldn't relax. He muttered something about getting me some water, then slipped out of the room, taking the trash with him. When he returned, he was suddenly more attentive than ever, hovering over me like a man trying to redeem himself. But no matter what he did, I stayed silent. I ran out of words long ago. After years of endless arguments and coldness, nothing was left to say. Once he had finished fussing over me, I finally broke the silence. "Tearing up the divorce papers doesn't change anything. I've made my decision. You've caused me to miscarry twice. We have no future, James." James collapsed into the chair beside the bed, gripping his hair in frustration. "I admit the first miscarriage was my fault, but how could you hide this one from me? Don't you think that's wrong?" "Yes, I acted impulsively, but my heart was in the right place. I just wanted to clear things up between you and Lindsay. Why else would I have taken you to that event? I didn't invite you to the other ones, did I?" He continued, his voice desperate. "I know your drinking limit better than anyone. I thought you were just mad and didn't want to reconcile, so I panicked. I didn't want Lindsay to be humiliated in front of everyone. If you had told me the truth, I never would have forced you to drink." His words were pathetic, and I couldn't believe he was still trying to shift the blame onto me. I cut him off, and my voice was as cold as ice. "Whether or not you've thought it through has nothing to do with me anymore. I don't care about your team-building events. Plus, we don't need a child. What we need is a divorce. It's over, James." His eyes filled with despair and his voice cracked as he pleaded, "Shannon, I know I messed up, but can't you forgive me just this once? I'll take back the house. I'll give you all the shares. We've been together for so long, I know who my real wife is. I was just making up for the mistakes of my youth with her making up for it with a child." I cut in, my tone sharp. He hadn't expected me to know about Lindsay's pregnancy. His face went pale and panic set in as he tried to explain. "That was an accident. I was drunk at a business event and she came to pick me up." His voice trailed off, weak, as cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He knew how hollow his excuse sounded. Maybe he suddenly decided that having a child was a good idea because Lindsay was pregnant. Maybe, in his mind, I was just caught up in her good fortune. But in the end, I had nothing. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I've forgiven you so many times this past year. Not just this year. During the 7 years before Lindsay came back, I knew you were in touch with her. I pretended not to care. I never imagined she'd come back and take you away completely." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "But now, I've come to terms with it. I don't want you anymore." He fell silent, no longer arguing. Instead, he became even more attentive, caring for me with a dedication I hadn't seen in the 8 years we'd been married. James carefully and gently wiped me down thrice a day with wet towels. Then, he applied the skin care products he used to mock, meticulously avoiding the wound on my head as he washed and dried my hair. He took notes on every doctor's instruction and followed them to the letter. James memorized when to change my bandages and when I needed my medication. He was more diligent than I was. He even learned to cook, delivering meals to me on time daily, and delivering dishes he'd found online. It was as if our roles had reversed. All the care I had given him over the years was now being repaid, just in time for our divorce. His once all-important job was moved online, and he managed everything from the hospital room. The nurses on the ward talked about how I had the perfect husband, joking about setting their standards for marriage based on James. None of them knew why I was really in the hospital. The more attentively he cared for me, the more I realized how foolish I had been. I used to think he didn't know how to care for people, but I saw the truth. He was competent, and just had never wanted to. During this time, Lindsay sent countless messages, all of which James ignored. She 12:02-12:13 complained about headaches, stomachaches, and everything in between, but he refused to leave my side. Eventually, annoyed by her persistence, he would step into the hallway to take her calls, telling her to stop bothering him. One night, as I lay in bed pretending to be asleep, he answered another call from her. The room was so quiet that I could hear Lindsay's soft sobs through the phone. She cried for a long time, but all she got in return was a cold, heartless response. "Get an abortion. I've scheduled the surgery." The next day, I called my lawyer right in front of James. Calmly, I told him I planned to sue my husband for transferring funds to his mistress during our marriage, and that I intended to recover every penny. James heard every word but didn't say anything. Without a single response, he turned and left the hospital room, heading to the obstetrics department to schedule Lindsay's abortion. That's when it hit me. Lindsay had fallen entirely out of favor. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt hollow. Surprisingly, James didn't try to stop me from suing him. Instead, he handed over all the financial records detailing every dollar he'd spent on Lindsay. He claimed he didn't want to risk the evidence being inadmissible in court. I noticed a hopeful glint in his eyes, but I stayed silent. I accepted the records without hesitation, even though a small part of me felt Lindsay didn't deserve this level of betrayal, not even after everything. The day of the scheduled abortion arrived, and by then, Lindsay had already received the lawyer's letter. But she never showed up for the procedure. Curious, I quietly slipped out of my hospital room and hid around the corner of the hallway, just out of sight. I watched as frustration slowly crept over James's face. He lost control, shouting at his phone like he used to yell at me. For a full hour, he ranted, dragging up grievances from the past year, and even issues from when they first separated a decade ago. He tried to threaten Lindsay with the house and shares, but she still didn't show. In the end, they had to cancel the procedure. Satisfied, I slipped back into my room unnoticed. That evening, James got a call from the company. Lindsay had filed a formal complaint under her real name, blowing the whistle on their use of substandard materials and false advertising practices. She even exposed how profits and taxes had been falsified. The scandal was already public, and an investigation team had entered the company. Operations were shut down, and if the company couldn't deliver materials to its clients on time, they'd face massive penalties for breach of contract. James hung up, trembling with rage, then hurled his phone across the room. I pretended to be startled and asked innocently, "What's going on?" Seeing my concerned expression, his anger softened. His voice was gentler when he replied, "Nothing. Just some trouble at work." I nodded sympathetically. "You should go back, then. I'll be discharged in a couple of days." Without a second thought, he quickly packed his things. Before leaving, he paused at the door and reminded me, "Text me when you're discharged. I'll come pick you up." As soon as he was gone, I sprang into action. I contacted a well-known paparazzo and hired him to stake out Lindsay's villa, gathering evidence of James's infidelity, not to sue him, but to ruin his reputation. I wasn't wrong. After leaving the hospital, James headed straight to the villa. But when he arrived, he found Lindsay completely naked, wrapped in the arms of a younger man. It couldn't have been more obvious. James immediately flew into a rage, questioning the paternity of the child she was carrying and threatening to take back the shares and the house he'd given her. He even vowed to sue her for fraud if she didn't comply. But what James didn't know was that Lindsay had already secretly sold the shares for cash. The confrontation quickly turned violent. The paparazzo captured the scene in photos and videos and sent them to my phone. I didn't hesitate. I posted the evidence in the comments section of Lindsay's public complaint about the company. The scandal blew up online, with the dramatic twists and turns captivating everyone. By the time the police arrived, they had to tear them apart physically. All three, James, Lindsay, and the younger man, were left bruised and battered. That same night, while I was being discharged from the hospital, Lindsay was being admitted. James had beaten her so severely James had no idea what I had done, and to my surprise, he was even worried about dragging me down with him. The same night, he was taken to the police station, where he signed the divorce papers. Not only did he agree to all the terms, but he also willingly chose to leave the marriage with nothing, transferring the house to me. He sent me a message, telling me not to worry about him, and promising that he would handle everything. I read the message without emotion, deleted his contact information, and blocked his number. I couldn't believe I had been deceived by such a fool for 8 years. Did James really think Lindsay had magically uncovered his company's long-hidden flaws on her own? No, it was me. I had anonymously sent Lindsay the evidence, giving her the perfect opportunity for revenge. I had experienced firsthand the agony of being abandoned while pregnant. No woman can accept her child as collateral damage. Given the chance, I knew Lindsay wouldn't let James get away with it. And she didn't disappoint me. Lindsay went even further than I expected. Before Lindsay could even recover and leave the hospital, the lawsuit I had filed against her went to court. With James's evidence, all the funds he had transferred to her had to be returned to me. Even though she had sold off the shares, I was entitled to half the money she had received. Lindsay tried to argue that the money James gave her was salary and bonuses, which she claimed to have earned. But when the judge asked for proof, she couldn't produce a single employment contract. When the verdict was delivered, her face turned pale, drained of color, and her expression was incensed. "Shannon, don't think you've won. James's company is ruined. You'll get nothing." I looked at her, amused by her bitterness, and replied calmly, "We're already divorced. Besides, I never needed to rely on a man to make money. Didn't I tell you that from the start? I'm an executive myself. What's he to me? For the past 8 years, I have freely given to him. When I loved him, he was my everything. Now that I don't love him anymore, he is nothing more than a stepping stone." Unfazed by her hateful glare, I left. My vacation had ended, and I returned to work the next day as usual. Meanwhile, Lindsay still faces the fraud charges James has filed against her. She didn't even have time to recover in the hospital. On the day of her trial, the investigation team completed their review of James's company, bringing back irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing. The company was officially declared bankrupt and shut down. James also lost the fraud case against Lindsay because the chat logs proved that the money transfers had been voluntary. Lindsay sold the villa, took whatever assets she had left, and disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, James was left with billions in debt and massive penalties for breach of contract. With the negative press surrounding the company and the scandal of his affair, James's reputation was utterly destroyed. He would never have a chance to recover. For the rest of his life, he would be branded by this shame. A week later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number out of town. James's voice was low and controlled on the other end. He told me he had found Lindsay and that he was going to avenge me. Then, the call abruptly ended. When I tried to call back, there was no signal. The same night, an online video showed a couple jumping onto the train tracks. The deceased were identified as James and Lindsay. I turned off my phone, rubbed my tired temples, and returned to work. They had finally disappeared from my life completely. Finally, I became the main character in my own narrative.